Good day, everyone. We are the Group 3 presenting to you Chapter 7 titled Movement. For the chapter outline, as you can see, we will be tackling upon three topics, starting with the control of movement, brain mechanisms of movement, and lastly, movement disorders. Movement depends on muscle contractions. Vertebrate muscles fall into three categories, which are smooth muscles, which control the digestive system and other organs. There's also skeletal or striated muscles, which control movement of the body in relation to the environment. And lastly, cardiac muscles, which controls the heart. Now, as you can see on the side here, we have an image of the three muscles. Now, there is no need to discuss them further as they have already been discussed in zoology class. A neuromuscular junction is a synapse between a motor neuron, axon, and a muscle fiber. An axon at a skeletal muscle releases acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, causing a muscle contraction, and a deficit of acetylcholine or its receptors impairs movement. So, in short, all vertebrate nerve muscle junctions use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. There are also antagonistic muscles, which are pairs of muscles that work together to move your bones. So, when you move your arms back and forth, it uses the antagonistic muscles. Now, examples of antagonistic muscles are flexors and extensors. Flexors are contracts to bend a joint and decreases the angle between bones, while the extensors contracts to straighten a joint and increase the angle between bones. Movement includes speaking, walking, threading a needle, and throwing a basketball while off balance and evading two defenders. Different kinds of movements need different kinds of control by the nervous system. Now, reflexes. Reflexes are the consistent automatic response to stimuli, and we generally think of reflexes as involuntary because they are sensitive to reinforcements, punishments, and motivations. One example is the stretch reflex, and another is the constriction of the pupils in response to bright lights. Now, you may be asking, what are involuntary movements? Involuntary movements mean they are insensitive to reinforcements, punishments, and motivations. And just like what I mentioned, the examples are the stretch reflex, constriction of pupils in response to bright light. And we also have voluntary movements, which are intentional, conscious action controlled by the brain and directed by the skeletal muscles. So examples would be walking and arm swinging. Similarly, some movements are ballistic and others are corrected by feedback. A ballistic movement, such as a reflex, is executed as a whole, but most behaviors are subject to feedback correction. When a person threads a sewing needle, they make a slight movement, check their aim, and then readjust. Similarly, when a singer holds a single note, hears any wavering of the pitch, they immediately correct it. Many rapid sequences of behavior depend on central pattern generators, which are neural mechanisms in the spinal cord that generate rhythmic patterns of motor movement. Now, a fixed sequence of movements is a motor program. For example, a mouse periodically grooms itself by sitting up, licking its paws and wiping them over its face, closing its eyes as the paws pass over them, licking the paws again, and so forth. Once begun, the sequence is fixed from beginning to end. Now, our muscles range from fast twitch fibers with fast contractions and rapid fatigue to slow twitch fibers with less vigorous contractions and no fatigue. Now, slow twitch fibers do not fatigue because they are aerobic, which means they use oxygen during their movements. You can think of them as a pay as you go, while fast twitch fibers are anaerobic, which means using reactions that burn fatty acids without needing oxygen at the time, but requiring oxygen for recovery. We also have muscle control by proprioceptor. Now you may be asking, what is a proprioceptor? Proprioceptor comes from the Latin word proprius, which means one's own. It is a receptor that detects the position or movement of a body part. In these cases, a muscle. Muscle proprioceptors detect the stretch and tension of a muscle and send messages that enable the spinal cord to adjust its signals. When a muscle is stretched, the spinal cord sends a signal to contract it reflexively. This stretch reflex is caused by a stretch. It does not produce one. One kind of proprioceptor is the muscle spindle. It is a receptor parallel to the muscle that responds to a stretch. When the muscle is stretched, the muscle spindle sends a message to a motor neuron in the spinal cord, which in turn sends a message back to the muscle, causing a contraction. We also have Golgi tendon organs, which are proprioceptors in the tendons at opposite ends of a muscle. They respond to increases in muscle tension. Now, some muscles are so strong that they could damage themselves if too many fibers contracted at once. Golgi tendon organs detect the tension that results during a muscle contraction, sending messages to the spinal cord to inhibit the motor neurons. In doing so, they put on the brakes to prevent an excessive contraction. Now, overall, the proprioceptors not only control important reflexes, but also provide the brain with information.
Now that we have discussed the different types of muscles, how muscles produce movement, and the different units of movement, we can now move on to the part that actually controls and coordinates these movements, which is the brain. So let's first talk about the cerebral cortex. Now, what is cerebral cortex? The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain. So it plays an important role in many complex functions, including movement, sensation, thinking, and decision making. So when it comes to movement, the cerebral cortex is responsible for planning and controlling voluntarily movements. So for example, when we decide to walk, raise our hand, or pick up an object, our brain sends signals to the appropriate muscles to perform that movement. The cerebral cortex is divided into different areas, and several of these areas work together to control movement. Now let's look at the motor-related areas of the cerebral cortex. One important area is the primary motor cortex. It is mainly responsible for controlling voluntary movements by sending signals to skeletal muscles. Another area is the premotor cortex, which helps plan and organize movements, especially movements that are guided by sensory information. There is also the supplementary motor area, which helps coordinate and plan movements, particularly when a movement involves a sequence of actions. So these areas don't work separately, they work together to help us plan, initiate, and control our movements. So how does the cerebral cortex actually control movement? First, the brain plans the movement. For example, if we decide to reach for a glass, different areas of the brain help determine how that movement should be performed. Then, the motor cortex sends signals through the nervous system toward the muscles involved. So these signals eventually reach the muscles and cause them to contract, producing the desired movement. At the same time, the brain receives information from our senses and proprioceptors about the position and movement of our body. So this allows the nervous system to make adjustments and keep the movement accurate. So in simple terms, the brain plans the movement, sends the instructions, and receives feedback to help control and adjust the movement. And that explains how the cerebral cortex plays an important role in controlling our movements. But movement is not controlled by the cerebral cortex alone. Other parts of the brain also contribute to making our movements smooth, coordinated, and accurate. And with that, we can now proceed to the next part of our discussion.
Hello everyone, my name is Giandanica Tirolion and I am here to talk about the basal ganglia and the conscious decision and movement. So first, let's talk about what is basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are a group of structure located deep inside the brain wrapping around the thalamus. They act like a control center for our movements. The main parts are the caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, substantia nigra, and nucleus accumbens. Note that the dorsal striatum is the combined name for the caudate nucleus and putamen. This is the main input center of the basal ganglia. So now let's proceed to the different parts of the basal ganglia and its function and simple example. First is the caudate nucleus and the putamen, also known as the dorsal striatum. It selects and initiates voluntary movements, helps learn new skills and habits. Example is that when you first learned to ride a bike, you had to think about every move. Now you can ride without thinking. This part helped turn that skill into a habit. Since katong bata pa ta, nag-learn ta og how to ride a bike, so may tabo jud na is always jud na siya mag-practice. Until kanang practice is more po na siya gihapog skill. And then ang buhaton ni dorsal striatum ana is that it turn into niya into habit. So kana siyang habit is mura na siya ma-program sa imong body. Nga every time nga mosakay kag bike, inya na nga movement ang imong buhaton. So maskin pag pila ka months nga niundang nakagsakay og bike and then nagsakay na mo balik og bike, makadumdum gyapon ka sa imong mga movement because naka-program na to siya nimo or like nahimo na to nimo siyang habit. Siguro there are instances nga ma-out of balance ka but dili siya para sa unang mo back to zero jud bitaw ka nga wala naka kabalog unsay buhaton nimo. Next is the globus pallidus. It inhibits unwanted movements, control what signals go to the thalamus. Example is that when you reach for a cup of coffee, this part stops your other hand from moving unnecessarily so you don't knock things over. So since kani si globus pallidus is like mura po ni siya o kanang kuan. If matakol na to later is kanang mo siya indirect pathway nga masyag nag-stop siya sa mga unnecessary movement nimo. Like kato sa example na mukuha ka o cup of coffee, like mag-grab ka, so ang isa ka kamot nimo is at rest jud na siya. Kay if ever nga magdungan na sila o may buhaton o may upturn, there is a possibility nga na kay manak makuan katong manak off or something baka mabundak nimo tong bunita ni mga cup of coffee or there's a possibility sa nga ma-spill siya nimo. So moto siya ang role ni globus pallidus which is it inhibits unwanted movement. So mura siya og naga-control sa mga unwanted movement or naga-block siya. So let's proceed to the substantia nigra. It produces dopamine which makes movement start smoothly. Like for example, if this part works well, you can stand up and walk easily. If it is damaged like in Parkinson's disease, starting to moving feels very difficult and slow. So from the example, nag-clear na siya nga explain nga if ever madamage imong substantia nigra is dili na gid smooth ang imong movement like even maglakaw or unsa pa nay buhaton nimo nga movement is maglisod na ka kay sa Parkinson's disease is dili man nimo siya makontrol imong movement like daghan kay kang kineme bitaw while nagkuan ka while nagtindog or even kastorya dili naman sila masabtan tungod kay lihok kay ang ilang lawas from head to toes pag yun na siya. And then if okay ra pud imong substantia nigra is that sakto lang pud like maka-rest imong body and then usahay gusto pud nimo nga malihok makontrol jud pud nimo compare sa katong guba na imong substantia nigra. And lastly is the nucleus accumbens. It links action toward motivation and habit formation. Like for example is that you keep practicing dancing because you feel happy and proud when you get the step right. This part connects that good feeling to your actions. The overall job of the basal ganglia does not decide what movement to make. Instead, it controls whether movements start or stop, how strong or fast the movement is, and blocks actions you do not need. It works through both the direct and indirect pathways to either start or stop action as needed. So the important note in this part, which is the katong two key pathway, is that this pathway control actions you choose and plan yourself, like deciding to stand up or draw. They also help turn new skills into automatic habits over time, like riding a bike or typing without looking at the keyboard. So now let's proceed to the next topic, which is the conscious decision and movement. So under ani siya nga topic is nabilong si Libet experiment. So aning a study is the researcher wanted to find out when do we become aware of our voluntary movement. So kanis am gid ta ma-aware sa atong movement nga voluntarily like consciously inya na. So ang lang gibuhat nagwa sila ang mga participant and they were asked to move their wrist whenever they wanted and note exactly when they felt they decided to move. So gingnan nila ang mga participant nga sige kanang pwede kanus-an ninyo i-decide nga i-move ang inyong wrist. But you should be kanang kuan i-take note o kanus-an mo na aware nga or naka-decide gyud nga i-move in your wrist. So na siya mga measurement taking during this experiment. So first is we have the brain activity called the readiness potential. Then second is the time of reported conscious decision. And the third is the time the actual movement began. So now let's talk about the two key pathways. So first is the direct pathway, which is the go signal, and the indirect pathway, which is the stop signal. So first let's tackle about the direct pathway. It removes blocks so movement can start easily. Example is that when your friend waves at you, this pathway helps you raise your hand and wave back right away without hesitation. So sa direct pathway is more siya initiation or voluntary movement bitaw siya sa imong lawas. Like automatic lang bitaw siya nga mo react every time buhaton na nimo siya. Kay mura kita mo siya nahimong habit. Like for example, ako. And then makakita ko sa akong friend, usually jud nga makakita ko sa akong friend is either mo wave sad ko nila or manawag jud ko nila. So inya na pod ang direct pathway. Automatic siya nga mo-link if ever buhaton to nimo siya nga action. So mo to siya ang naka-go signal. And then next is the indirect pathway, which is the stop signal. It blocks unnecessary or wrong movement. So for example ana is that if you are inside the library, so you have to do jud kay maghilom ka or dila ba if musturya man ka is dapat hinay lang. So mo na ang kakontrol ana is si indirect pathway nga murag mo stop signal siya nga dili ka magbanha since naka inside the library. But then after ana inigawas pud bitaw nimo sa library is like automatically pud nga mo go signal pud si direct pathway nga you're free to talk na or you're free to say anything na kay dili na wala na mo sa library. So mo to siya ang connection nilang duha. So stop and go. Always remember that the direct pathway is the go signal and the indirect pathway is the stop signal. So during sa Libet experiment na discovery nga nakita ang mga researcher ni kuan sila nga ang brain activity is preparing for movement starts 300 to 500 milliseconds before you feel you made a decision. So kita ko ng mga tao is wala pa ta naka-decide pero ang katong brain na siya happenings na process na mga plan unsa pa diha pero dili lang ta aware. Example ko na is that imagine if I ask you to tap your finger when you feel like it, you might think, okay, now I'll tap. But your brain actually started preparing that movement before you had the thought. So, ang ilang pagsabot is that kita mga tao wala pa ta naka-decide pero na plano sa atong utok pero dili lang jud ta aware. So murag naa siya timeline or like kanang sa atong pag-decide o pag-move. So ang una ko na mahitabuan na is the brain prepares unconsciously. Then number two is you feel I decided to move. So kana na maghunahuna ko nga mulihok ba ko or dili. And then three which is naka-decide na ka na mo move, which is the movement happens. This means that conscious awareness comes 200 to 300 milliseconds after the brain has already started preparing. This tells us that conscious decision is not the cause of movement. It happens after the brain has already begun the process. It's not that you don't have free will, it just means your brain begins working on it before you are aware of it. So, finally, let's wrap up or summarize all the things that we have learned today. So, first is the basal ganglia, which controls starting, stopping, and strength of movement. Then, the pathway, which is the direct and indirect. Direct is for the go signal, and indirect is for the stop signal. Then, conscious decision, which is the brain prepares movement before you are aware of it. Cerebral cortex and motor plan and send movement signals before you move. Mirror neurons helps you understand other actions like when you smile back at someone who smiles at you. Spinal pathway, which is the lateral, hands and feet, opposite side. Medial is the posture and balance, and the cerebellum, which makes movement accurate and timid, like hitting a ball or balancing on one foot. In conclusion, every move you make is not just your muscle working, it is your brain planning, controlling, and even starting the movement before you realize it. That shows how amazing and complex our brain truly is.
Hello everyone. So, my topic is all about movement disorders. So, when we say movement, the way kita ni move, 'di ba? Movement. This is what you call movement. So, movement disorder. So, if you have a damage in your spinal cord, peripheral nerves, or muscles, you cannot move. So, it's because it's connected to each other, di ba? So, but cognitively, you are the same as ever. So, brain disorders that impair your movement also impair your mood, memory, and cognition. So, uh, if you observe the old ones, like once bitaw na ma-slide sila or accident, then maapektuhan ilang. Like, ang something na impact jud is ang ang iyahang spinal cord. So, di ba, na mga possibility na mao na hinungdan nga nung dili sila kalakaw, like ma-paralyze after the accident. That is why, that's because connected ang nerves so sa spinal cord. So, kung once nga kana ang ma-damage, maapektuhan jud ang movement because the nerves itself connected to the body parts na maoy maapektuhan ang movement. So according to our book, we have here two examples of movement disorder. First is the Parkinson disease and the Huntington's disease. So Parkinson disease is results from a gradual loss of dopamine and releasing axons going to the substantia and substantia nigra to the striatum. So, the symptoms The symptoms includes rigidity, muscle tremors, slow movements, and difficulty of initiating voluntary activity. So, if you observe, di ba na ay mga tigulang na, pero mahalakaw pa, like, at the age of 70. So, as you observe, di ba marag kanang shaky, nga na sila. And then, the way they walk kay mura og hinay, and then like naagya po shaky inigtekang. So that is one of the examples of the Parkinson disease. So tungod kay naapektuhan na ang nerves or ang kuan or sa spinal cord ba na. So di ba slow sila. So that's one of the examples of Parkinson disease. So we have treatments, but yeah, it's more like the therapy. We have here the L-DOPA treatment and the non-pharmaceutical therapies. So, kaning L-DOPA treatment, it uses a chemical levodopa, if I am not mistaken. So, which enters to the brain and turns into dopamine, which helps controls the slow movement, tremors, or the stiffness. So that is how it treats Parkinson's disease. And the non-pharmaceutical therapies kay di ba nag-state ko ganihan na ma-paralyze after the accident kay naapektuhan ang spinal cord or nerves that connects to the body nga wala na ning move or wala na ni na lihok. So we have here the physical therapy which will help the nerves nga murag mo kuan siya balik or there is something there na once you undergo a physical therapy, there's a chance na maulian gyud, like yeah, per session. Kung musunod lang ka sa per session, and there's a possibility na maulian gyud ka sa imuhang like paralyzed and a stroke or anything na under sa Parkinson disease. The next disease is the Huntington's disease. So it is a rare inherited genetic disorder that causes progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. So kani, one of the symptoms of Huntington's disease is the involuntary jerking or writhing movements, muscle rigidity, or muscle contracture. So, or there's a slow or unusual eye movements, trouble walking, or keeping posture and balance. And then one of the best example of it is the trouble with speech or swallowing. So, have you observed that uh, there's a people na maglisod siya og litok sa usa ka word or sa usa ka like like that, di ba more magbalik-balik ang iyang syllables before niya straightforward og litok ang word, right? Like for example, hey. Oh, murag ingat na bitaw. There's something wrong with that. So some of the diagnosis, it can be Huntington's disease. Then, one of the therapy of it is the AMT 130. So, AMT 130 is a genetic therapy that is used for Huntington's disease. It can be surgery or genetic experiment so that nga ma-help to control the Huntington's disease or to cure. But scientifically speaking, there is no cure pagyud sa Huntington's disease. So it can be prevented or
ma-minimal lang ang ma-minimal ang effects or symptoms. And other treatment is similar to Parkinson disease, which involves physical, occupational, and speech therapy. So, one of these is kato, maglisod og storya katong aaasa ka nga na. So naana siya speech therapy so that the person experiencing trouble with speech, little by little doing speech therapy, ma-undergo to niyang mga session, mabot ang time na ma-completely state na niya. 'Di ba? Ako gani, charis. So, inga na siya. Then physical for the trouble for walking or posture balance, yan na. And then occupational therapy. So, a little bit similar sa Parkinson disease. When we say movement disorders, it doesn't mean that it only affect movement. Movement disorder affect more than just a movement. Yes, that is true because when you have this movement disorder, it can affect you cognitively, sa imong verbal, how you speak, how you walk, how you move, not just movement alone, di ba? So, Parkinson disease and Huntington's disease emphasizes the point that control of movement is closely related to cognition. Syempre, kay ang brain ang nag-dominate, so once na ang mga parts, nerves, or connected to each other, din mao'y ma-damage. So, dili kay movement alone lang ang maapektuhan. So, people with either condition are likely to suffer apathy, cognitive deficits, and a lack of pleasure and motivation. So, once again, giingon nga lack of pleasure and motivation, murag dili na nila ma-enjoy ang ilang as a normal person. 'Di ba? Kung kintahay about to accident na abot sa accident or unsa to siya, 'di ba? Maotro siya. And bisan sa mga katong genetic heredity na genetic disease, dili nila ma-enjoy kung unsa ang a normal person because they have that kind of disease na they prevent them to freely walk, freely talk about this, that, nga, walay sagabal. So, the psychological problems often develops before any noticeable motor problem. So, in short, mechanisms of movement are also the mechanisms of thought. So, connected jud ang mind ug ang body. That is why, again, movement disorders affect more than just a movement. So, movement, it is where everyday part of our life. So, when we wake up, we move our eyes to open it, move backward, di ba? So, movement is the very essential pod. And that's all for our topic, which is the movement. I hope you guys learned something about it. And please, please, please be careful the way how you move because it can affect your entire body. Thank you and God bless.